is the natural recovery rate from what we call psychosis or serious mental illness? Because when we think about that, if it's in fact quite high, then if you have supportive environments, you can even expand on that sort of natural capacity to recover. From 1945 to 55, 1955 is when the first antipsychotics come in. And the memory is, the sort of conventional narrative is that until the time of antipsychotics, no one got released from the asylums. They just stayed there forever. Well, if you look at discharge and stay well rates from first episode psychotic patients from 1945 to 1955, you'll find studies such as this. At Warren State Hospital from 1946 to 1950, at the end of 3 years, 73% of those patients were living, of those first episode patients were living in the community. And again, this is before we had, disability insurance, that sort of thing, social services out in the community. At Delaware State Hospital, 70% of 216 schizophrenia patients were living in the community 6 years or more after initial hospitalization. You see the same in other countries, in Norway and all. So what we saw in this brief period before the arrival of antipsychotics, many people were going into the hospital, and frankly, those hospitals weren't great, that's for sure. And in fact, could be, I think, quite abusive, dismal environments, and still people were getting better and going back out. That speaks to this sort of natural capacity to recover. Now, going forward into that, we get the antipsychotics in 1955, they start to become the centerpiece of care. But in the 1970s, there were 3 studies to look at, are we really improving longer-term outcomes with the use of these antipsychotics? One was a study, a 3-year study at University in San Francisco under Maurice Rappaport, randomized study. They found that those treated in the hospital without drugs compared to those treated in the hospital with drugs, and then the people are discharged, those treated without drugs had better 3-year outcomes. There was a 1-year study that also looked at the long-term effects of antipsychotics, and again, it was the people off medication that had the better outcomes. And then the big study was the Soteria Project. It was imagined or created and designed by Lauren Mosher, who was head of schizophrenia studies at the NIMH at the time, and it really was meant to be the dividing line moment. We've been doing things where drugs are the first order of care, but how about environmental care? When you can be with people, you don't see people as ill, you see that supportive environments can help, being with others can help, and maybe some selective use of antipsychotics. People were randomized either to treatment or quasi-randomized. Treatment as usual in the hospital, or to the Soteria Project, which Voice Hendricks ran for 10 years. And there they didn't immediately put people on antipsychotics. They would if they weren't getting better after a period of time. And what were the results? The results were that at 6 weeks, the psychopathology in both groups had improved significantly and overall change was the same. In other words, this environmental care was just as good as drugs in decreasing the acute symptoms of psychosis. And at the end of 2 years, the Soteria patients had lower psychopathology scores, fewer hospital readmissions, and better global adjustments. So what we saw at this time, 50 years ago, was a different way of treating people, a different way of conceiving things. And it really was with the idea that environments, if you had supportive environments, in essence, that would allow for these sort of this natural capacity to recover to flourish best.